This is historian Stephen Ujifusa. Welcome to Wet Lunch on the High Seas. Well, there's a very, very long history of America and China engaged in trade wars and trade disputes. As we all know from the news, President Donald Trump and Chairman Xi of China are involved in basically a test of wills about tariffs. In early April, Donald Trump declared that America would slap very large tariffs on all imported goods, except for, most interestingly, Russia. But China received the highest tariffs, tariffs of about 150% on all imported goods. China retaliated with similarly high tariffs, and we are currently in a pretty scary standoff right now, where there's now rumblings of shelves being empty soon because America, for the past 40 years or so, has increasingly outsourced its manufacturing capacity to China for cheaper labor prices. And Trump has recently said that Americans might have to get used to $2 rather than $30 under the Christmas tree. It's interesting that America, almost as soon as it had achieved independence from Great Britain at the end of the long, bloody Revolutionary War in 1783, one of the first things that its merchant community did was organize a syndicate to send a trading vessel, which they named the Empress of China, from New York to Canton. Canton at the time was the only port in the Celestial Kingdom that was open to Western traders. And their hope was to establish relations with China. And as we all know from the history books, in 1773, a group of Bostonians stormed aboard a British East India Company vessel, actually two of them, and threw chests of China overboard in protest of the Tea Acts and the Stamp Acts that placed a large tax on tea that was being sold to what was then the American colonies. I guess you could say that was, in many ways, a kind of a protest against a tariff, a tax on imported goods. But the demand for tea and Chinese goods in the young United States was extremely strong still, even especially after the deprivations of the Revolutionary War. And the American colonies, the new American nation, did not have a whole lot of things that the Celestial Kingdom wanted to buy. And this first journey of the Empress of China, she returned back to New York City, loaded with tea that was hastily grabbed by the desperate and very eager traders of New York, wanting to sell it to the populace who had been deprived of their tea for so long. This sparked a kind of arms race among New York, Philadelphia, and New England mercantile families to establish beachheads in Canton, China, to establish their own trading firms there. So the American traders were faced with this problem. There was a huge demand in America for tea and other Chinese products. The only thing that the Chinese really wanted to buy from us was ginseng, which had medicinal properties, and that was grown mostly in Vermont. When the textile trade took off in New England, when Americans basically pirated British weaving technology, water loom technology, and brought it to the United States, exported cotton goods became something that was in demand by the Chinese. As well as beaver pelts. John Jacob Astor, one of America's first, probably the first millionaire in America, he made his fortune in the beaver trade. But the thing that made up the difference of this trade deficit was something that the Americans pirated off of the English in terms of ideas. The English have been smuggling opium into China since the 1760s, after the British East India Company effectively conquered India. This is an example of a private corporation, not the British Navy, not the British Army. that effectively took over India and then was under the protection of the British military. The Americans decided to do pretty much the same thing. And starting in the 1790s, they began smuggling in opium from India. They basically did it under consignment. They used their ships to smuggle British consigned opium or owned opium to China. But they also smuggled opium in from Turkey. It was cheaper and of lower quality. This was pioneered by the Boston merchant Thomas Handyside Perkins. And there was a contentious relationship, as could be understood, or is very understandable, between the British and the Americans. They had just fought a very nasty, bloody war. And the Revolutionary War, unlike we might think of from the history books, was not some cute little affair in which men fought in nice uniforms and in wigs and knee breeches. It was a nasty, ugly, drawn-out guerrilla war that lasted for years and broke families in two in terms of who sided with which, whether the patriots or the loyalists. And a lot of these New Englanders were very ambivalent to being crowded into quarters with British traders. In Canton, from the 1790s until the 1840s, all foreigners, all Westerners, were confined to a small set of buildings in Canton Harbor that were known as the Factory District. This was an all-male enclave. If families came along, if women and children came along, they were confined to the Portuguese colony of Macau at the delta of the Pearl River, about 80 miles downstream. And the War of 1812 made matters worse because the Royal Navy blockaded and even bombarded New England ports and ruined the New England economy, which was a maritime-based economy. And this tension was eventually resolved after these British and American traders realized, in spite of their past differences, by the 1830s, they still spoke a common language and they needed each other. The British had been established in Canton much longer than the Americans, of course, most notably with houses such as Jardine and Matheson, which was deeply involved in the opium trade. And American houses such as Russell and Company, that was based out of Boston, realized that they had to basically play footsie with the British opium traders in order to make money. And they carried their opium on consignment as well as carrying their own from Turkey. So this became a symbiotic relationship. By the 1830s, China was faced with a massive problem. For most of this trading history between the West and China, there was a trade deficit and silver was flowing into the Chinese empire. But opium, the highly addictive drug, which was now being used recreationally by thousands upon thousands of Chinese, was causing silver to flow out of the imperial coffers. So China, which since 1451 had gone anti-globalist, between the fall of the Roman Empire and maybe the 17th century, China was the most advanced technologically and intellectually society in the world. And in 1451, the Chinese government ended all deep sea trading voyages that went as far as East Africa. So China, for quite a while, was at the forefront of globalization. And the Chinese government made a very conscious decision in 1451 to close itself in and basically become a protectionist insular society. They felt they were big enough and rich enough to exist without foreign trade, specifically trade with the West. And as we all know, China was the long-sought goal of Christopher Columbus and other European traders. So America, at the same time, could not afford to be insular. It was in the late 18th and early 19th century, it was a small, rising, pretty weak and fragile nation, a republic, that although it had immense natural resources in its interior, still was very much a sea-bound nation, and it needed globalization global trade to survive, especially big cities such as New York, Philadelphia, and Boston. And these Yankee traders that arrived in China, it was a very small, select club. These were some of the most cosmopolitan people probably in the world. I mean, they had originated in small towns such as New Bedford or in moderate-sized cities. But men like John Murray Forbes, Warren Delano II, Abiel Abbott Lowe, they traveled halfway around the world and spent 10 years or so in China to make their fortune, forge relationships, and what happened in Canton stayed in Canton. They didn't write home really about what they were trading to get the much coveted tea that was sent home and sold for a magnificent profit. And in 1839, the Chinese government decided that enough was enough with this foreign mud, as they called it, this drug that was being smuggled into the Celestial Kingdom. And a new commissioner of the port of Canton, a gentleman named Commissioner Liu, seized 20,000 chests of opium that mostly was the property of British traders and dumped it into the Pearl River. After basically besieging the factory district, trying to get them to release this stuff. The British traders departed in a huff, saying, "How dare you steal our opium? We'll be back with the protection and guns and force of the Royal Navy." The American traders, most notably Warren Delano II, stayed behind and shipped Chinese goods to the Dutch East Indies, where it was then picked up by British ships and then shipped home for what these traders said was a magnificent profit. John Murray Forbes back in Boston would later say that for most of his business career, and this spanned railroads, it spanned land ventures, China trading, he said most of his ventures throughout his very long business career paid not much more than 6%, except for this brief period where the British were gone from Canton and his house of Russell and Company was making a heck of a lot more than that on its money. The British Royal Navy entered Canton Harbor in 1840 and blew the Chinese Navy, which was outdated. It was a wooden junk wooden junks powered by sails against modern steamships. So the Chinese Navy was utterly destroyed in this. And in compensation, as reparations for this, especially for the opium, but also for the military expedition, the British demanded that several additional ports be opened to Western trade, including the ports of Shanghai and also a small island that the Chinese thought was relatively useless, but would prove to be the ultimate base of British and also American operations for trading, the island of Hong Kong. Then this remained a British possession until 1997. So China did not want to be part of the global system, but the British Royal Navy forced them open. The Americans piggybacked off of this. The American Navy, the U.S. Navy, played no part in this. But American traders such as Warren Delano II were more than happy to have British firepower operate in their interests. Warren Delano II, in fact, stood on board one of the British warships that bombarded Canton in 1840 and basically said, well, I've never liked the British, but the Chinese are getting what they deserve for being so close-minded. Fast forward to 2025. China still remembers this start of what they call, to this day, the century of humiliation, in which what was once the most advanced and the mightiest empire in the world, which by 1900 or so, most of its coastal cities had become essentially controlled by Western powers and had devolved into a dysfunctional and impoverished imperial monarchy. It was basically ungovernable. And China has not forgotten this. They have not forgotten what the Western powers did to China to extract what they wanted from the Chinese economy. most notably tea and Chinese goods, in exchange for a highly addictive drug. Now it is America in 2025 that, under Trump, the Trump administration says we want to basically close off America and get other nations to pay tribute to us. It'll be interesting to see how this all pans out. This battle between what is now protectionist America and globalist China. And China is now picking up where it left off in 1451 by expanding its global reach into East Africa and into the Middle East, something that it stopped doing in 1451 but is doing. Well, America is now retreating from its global dominance. It's very odd to think that the trade war that devolved into a shooting match in the 1830s involved opium and tea. Now what this is involving is Barbie dolls and iPhones, and the fortunes of tech and toys and so many things are now dependent on China in this country. And I can't predict the future, but in the 19th century, it's interesting that China was protectionist and America was global. Now it's the other way around. How will this end? To be determined. This is historian Stephen Ujifusa, and this is the Wet Lunch in the High Seas podcast.